My name is Serena Caldwell. And last Christmas, I stood in my parents' kitchen in Columbus, hearing my mother tell Aunt Miriam that I had never sent them a single dollar, while Marcus nodded like the weight of our family had always been his to carry. I didn't interrupt when Lisa added that I was too busy with my Denver life to care. And the soft murmur around them made it clear this wasn't the first time they'd rehearsed that line. Marcus caught my eye for a brief second before looking away. And that tiny avoidance told me he knew exactly what 15 years of transfers meant and had chosen silence anyway. I stepped into the hallway without touching a coat or greeting a soul. Letting her words echo through me, never sent us a single dollar, as if the $360,000 carved out of my life in monthly pieces had never existed. Daniel found me in the hallway, gripping my phone like it was the only solid thing left. And when he asked, "What did she say to you in there?" I told him exactly how Lisa had wiped 15 years off the face of my life as if the money had never moved. He didn't raise his voice or try to soothe me. He just said, "You need proof." Serena. Not another argument. And the steadiness in his tone made the air feel sharper than anything my mother had thrown at me. I walked outside to breathe, replaying Marcus's quick glance and the way he looked down at his shoes. And that single gesture pushed me to scroll to Patricia Gordon's number because she was the only person who had witnessed every transfer without ever asking why. When she answered with, "Serena, is everything all right?" I told her I needed the full 15-year record notarized before New Year's. And hearing her say, I can do that," felt like the first piece of ground that hadn't shifted under me all night. Patricia called me the next morning to confirm the timeline. And when she said, "I'll need your authorization to pull every transfer since 2010, I gave it without hesitation because Marcus's quiet shift of his eyes the night before had already told me there was nothing accidental about the story my parents repeated. She explained that the records would come with stamped confirmations from each institution and asked if I wanted them notarized. And I said, "Yes, all of it," hearing my own voice flatten in a way that made the number 15 feel heavier than the years themselves. While she worked, I sat at my kitchen table in Denver, reviewing the dates I had memorized by salary brackets. And each figure reminded me how easily Lisa had erased them when she told Aunt Miriam I had never sent a dollar. So when Patricia called back to say the packets were ready for pickup, I felt the first clean edge of resolve settle into place. I met with Thomas Reeder after Patricia confirmed the records were ready. And when he asked, "You want to remove Greg and Lisa from every beneficiary designation?" I told him yes because hearing my mother insist I had never sent a dollar had closed something in me that I didn't plan to reopen. He opened my file and explained how the revisions would reshape my will, my life insurance, and every contingent allocation tied to my estate. He walked me through the documents while I kept replaying the way Lisa told Aunt Miriam that I had never helped them. And that memory made each line I initialed feel almost overdue. When he asked whether I wanted to leave even a symbolic percentage for them, I said, "No, that chapter is finished." Because Greg's quiet agreement had already shown me exactly how they wanted my story told. I signed each page with the steadiness that came from knowing the notarized transfers were waiting in my bag. Before the final signature, Thomas said he needed me to confirm I was certain, and I told him, "I'm done underwriting a version of my life that erases me." He nodded once and stamped the final page, giving the room a silence that felt more honest than anything my parents had claimed in years. I gathered the updated folders, knowing those signatures were the first boundaries I had drawn with my own name. I landed in Columbus with the notarized transfers in my bag, and as I drove toward my parents' house, I kept hearing Lisa's voice insisting I had never sent a dollar, a line that felt even thinner now that every document with my name on it sat inches from my hand. When she opened the door and said, "You made it after all," I could hear the same practiced brightness she used whenever she wanted an audience to believe something. And the living room behind her was already filled with the noise of relatives congratulating Marcus on whatever story he'd told them this time. I walked in without correcting her tone or asking where Greg was. because the air carried enough familiarity to remind me how often this house had folded itself around a version of me that never quite matched the facts. Greg finally appeared with a glass in his hand and said Marcus had been a real help this year. A line so casually delivered that it made the edges of my certainty sharpen. And the people around him nodded with the same easy confidence they'd shown at Thanksgiving. Marcus glanced at me only long enough to say, "Long drive from Denver," before turning back to a cousin who was asking him about some vague real estate plan he'd been floating for months. I set my coat aside and let their conversation continue, because every word in that room made the silence they'd built about my support feel louder. And louder was exactly what I needed to remember why I had come home. Aunt Miriam found me near the dining room doorway and asked, "Why haven't you been helping your parents if things have been so hard for them?" And the familiarity of her confusion reminded me exactly how easily Lisa's version of the truth traveled through this family. So I told her she would understand soon enough without offering anything more than the steadiness in my voice. She looked over at Marcus, who was laughing with two cousins about some vague real estate lead he claimed was about to close, and her expression softened into something like concern, though she didn't push me the way she usually did during holidays. I stayed beside her long enough to hear Greg mention again that Marcus had kept them afloat this year, a line so fluid it could have been scripted. And every nod around him made the silence about my support feel sharper. Marcus finally approached me with a cautious smile and said, "You didn't tell anyone you were coming," as if my arrival had interrupted a narrative he preferred to keep tidy. And I told him I didn't see the point in announcing myself when the house already seemed full of answers about who mattered. He shifted his weight and asked whether Denver had been treating me well, a question that carried more distance than curiosity. And I replied that it had been long enough since I'd heard my own name spoken without commentary. He nodded at the floor the same way he had the night Lisa erased 15 years of transfers. And the repetition in his posture told me he still had no intention of correcting anything on my behalf. Later, Cousin Dana asked if I planned to stay through New Year's, her tone warm but uncertain, and I said I would be there for the gathering because it felt like the right place to stand after so many years of being misrepresented. She glanced toward the living room where Lisa was praising Marcus for stepping up when it mattered most. And the ease with which that sentence slipped from her mouth settled into the air like something polished by repetition. I walked back toward the noise without offering any explanation, letting their conversations stack higher and higher. Because the fuller the room became with that version of events, the clearer it was what needed to be brought into the light. When the New Year's gathering reached its loudest point, Greg tapped his glass and said he wanted to acknowledge the person who carried this family through another hard year. And when he gestured toward Marcus, the room erupted in an applause so confident it almost sounded rehearsed. Lisa added that Marcus had stepped up in ways Serena never could, and her smile lingered on me just long enough to make clear she meant every syllable. I set my bag on the table without a word, feeling the weight of the documents inside settle in the air around us. Aunt Miriam leaned in and asked if I had anything to say. And I told her I did as I unzipped the bag and pulled out the first stack of notarized transfers. When Lisa said, "Serena, this isn't the time for your drama," I told her the time had been set by her own story, not mine, and placed the stamped pages in front of her. The room quieted in a way I hadn't heard in years, and even the music from the television faded behind the shift of people turning toward me. Greg said he didn't understand what I was trying to do, and I told him he already understood more than he wanted to admit because every dollar he'd claimed Marcus had provided was accounted for in my records. Marcus tried to laugh it off by saying, "She must have misunderstood something," but his voice thinned out on the last word as I handed the next stack to Uncle Joel, who scanned the totals without looking up. Cousin Dana whispered that the pages had bank seals on them, and the sound of her voice cut through the last traces of doubt in the room. Lisa reached for the papers and said they must be old estimates. So I told her she could check the dates herself because every transfer matched the years she'd told people I'd been absent. She flipped through the pages with a sharp inhale that didn't quite become a breath. And when she reached the most recent year, she froze as if the numbers had rearranged something she had counted on staying hidden. Greg asked Marcus to clarify whether he had contributed more than the family knew. And Marcus dropped his gaze to the table without answering. I explained that I had never asked for gratitude, only honesty, and that the silence they wrapped around my support was the only reason this conversation was happening in front of everyone. Lisa told me I was being cruel for bringing this up tonight, but I reminded her that she had been the one to tell Aunt Miriam I had never sent them $1, and that the documents only corrected her version. The room shifted again as relatives exchanged looks that carried more understanding than judgment. Greg asked what I wanted from all of this, and I told him I wanted exactly what he already had: the truth laid out, in a form no one could interrupt. Marcus finally muttered that he didn't think it mattered who sent what, and I told him it mattered the moment he let their story replace mine. I gathered the last stack from my bag and placed it beside the others, letting the silence around them grow into the answer they had been avoiding. When no one else spoke, I told them I would no longer be contributing financially, and that any assumption otherwise should end with the documents in front of them. Lisa said I couldn't mean that, after everything they had sacrificed. So I reminded her the record showed exactly who had sacrificed what. I stepped back from the table as the room remained frozen around the truth they had spent 15 years rewriting. When no one moved to speak, I told them I wasn't asking for reconciliation and said, I'm setting terms, not starting a debate. Letting the quiet confirm they finally understood this wasn't something they could talk over. Lisa stepped closer and insisted I couldn't possibly cut off family. So I looked at her and said she'd done that herself the moment she told people I'd contributed nothing. Greg muttered that I was being dramatic, and I told him the numbers on the table were the only drama in the room. I said I would not be sending another $1 and added, financial access ends tonight. As the pages on the table reflected every year, they'd counted on me without saying my name. Lisa whispered that they depended on me. So I told her dependence wasn't the same thing as entitlement, and that they had rewritten that difference for too long. Marcus tried to say he appreciated whatever I'd done, and I told him appreciation delivered 15 years late wasn't appreciation at all. Greg asked what I expected them to do now, and I told him they could start by telling the truth to every person they had misled, because repairing what they'd broken wasn't my work to carry. When Lisa protested that they'd only exaggerated because they were proud of Marcus, I reminded her she hadn't exaggerated, she'd erased. And erasure wasn't pride. The room stayed still long enough for me to feel how tightly they'd relied on the lie. I told them I had already updated my will and said, "There's no inheritance coming your way," which made Greg exhale like something had finally slipped out of his control. Lisa asked why I would go that far, and I told her I wasn't going far at all. I was simply aligning my documents with the reality they created. Marcus asked if there was anything he could say to change my mind, and I told him he'd had 15 years to say something and never used a single one of them. I said the only thing I wanted now was distance and added, "You won't hear from me unless you choose honesty," letting the words settle over the crowd that had watched the lie unravel. Lisa called after me as I stepped away from the table, but none of her words held shape anymore because the foundation they'd rested on was gone. When I reached the doorway, I told them this was the first boundary I'd drawn in my adult life, and I intended to keep it. In the days after I left Ohio, the messages that filled my phone came from everyone except the people who had built the lie. And Aunt Miriam called first to say, "Your mother keeps insisting it was all a misunderstanding," as if the notarized pages didn't exist. I told her I wasn't interested in revisions of the truth, and she said she understood because watching the room fall silent had shown her more than any explanation could. When she added that she hoped I knew she stood with me, I realized her voice carried something I hadn't heard from family in years' certainty. A week later, my father called and asked whether I planned to punish them forever, and I told him the only punishment was the absence they'd created themselves. He said they never meant for things to go this far. So I reminded him they'd gone this far long before I ever spoke a word. When he asked if I'd reconsider, I told him reconsideration required trust. And trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt on the same ground where it had been buried. The unexpected part came when my Aunt Patricia reached out from California and said, "Your story sounds too familiar." Her tone carrying the weight of someone who had already lived the ending I was just beginning. She told me she'd left for the same reason survival dressed up as distance, and her honesty felt steadier than any apology my parents had never offered. By the time we ended the call, I realized family could be chosen. And chosen family didn't require a ledger to recognize what you'd given. Back home in Denver, I felt something settle inside me. And when my husband asked if I felt any regret, I told him the only thing I felt was space wide enough for a life built without erasure. When the house finally felt quiet again, I realized the distance I had created wasn't a punishment but a place where my own life could breathe. And that understanding settled with a calm I hadn't known I was missing. I thought about the years I spent trying to earn what should have been freely given, and how the silence after setting boundaries felt more truthful than any apology I would never receive. In that stillness, I understood that choosing myself had never been the betrayal they claimed it was the correction. Back in Denver, I found comfort in the ordinary rhythms of my days. And when my husband asked how I wanted to move forward, I told him I wanted a future shaped by honesty rather than obligation. The life we were building felt steady in a way that didn't need proof or documentation because respect was already built into it. For the first time, the story I lived matched the story I told myself. If you stayed with me through this journey, thank you for listening. And if any part of my experience echoes something in your own life, I hope you'll subscribe and share your thoughts so we can keep growing this space together. Your voice matters here, and your presence means more than you know. Until next time, I hope you choose whatever brings you peace.